January 20th, 1961. The morning air over Washington, D.C. was sharp and brittle, the kind of cold that makes every breath visible. On the steps of the Capitol, cameras flashed as a young president took the oath of office, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the shining promise of a new era. Crowds cheered, the Marine Band played, and America turned the page. But one man was missing. Harry Truman, the 76-year-old former president who had once led the nation through the end of World War II, had not been invited. His chair, reserved at every inauguration since Roosevelt's death, sat empty. He had received no letter, no phone call, not even a formality from the Kennedy camp. The White House, the very building he had once rebuilt from the ground up, was now a place where his name had quietly been blacklisted. To the public, it looked like an oversight. But those inside the administration knew better. The ban had been deliberate, personal, and it came from the very top. 16 years earlier, Truman had occupied that same stage, hand on a Bible, inheriting a world in ruins. He had faced Stalin, rebuilt Europe, and created the foundation of American power in the Cold War. But to Kennedy, he was the past, the embodiment of an older, less glamorous America. And worse, Truman had made the mistake of underestimating the young senator from Massachusetts. It began quietly during the 1960 campaign, when Truman publicly mocked Kennedy's youth and inexperience. He told reporters, "He's too young, too untested. The presidency is no place for an amateur." Those words hit Kennedy like shrapnel. The two men never spoke again. By the time Kennedy entered the White House, the decision had been made. Truman would not cross its threshold. No visits, no consultations, no legacy dinners or handshakes for the cameras. Inside Kennedy's circle, aides called it the Missouri problem. Whenever Truman's name came up, Kennedy's jaw would tighten. He saw the old man not as an ally, but as a relic who had dared to question his legitimacy before the nation. And so, for the first time in American history, a former president was effectively banned from the home he once lived in. No announcement was made, but the silence was loud enough. When asked by a reporter if he planned to visit the new president, Truman smiled faintly and said, "Well, they haven't asked me." Behind that polite restraint was something colder, a quiet humiliation that would soon turn into a political Cold War of its own. It started in the summer of 1960, long before the inaugural snub in a smoky hotel ballroom in Los Angeles. The Democratic National Convention was in full swing, and the Kennedy campaign had transformed the event into a spectacle of youth and optimism. Television cameras caught every handshake, every smile, and every moment of resistance from the old guard. Harry Truman, retired but still influential, watched the proceedings from Independence, Missouri. To him, the Democratic Party had become unrecognizable, polished, ambitious, and, in his words, run by publicity men instead of public servants. When reporters asked if he supported Kennedy's nomination, Truman didn't hesitate. He said flatly, "Senator Kennedy's trying to buy the presidency like a sack of potatoes." Those words landed like artillery fire. Kennedy's camp was livid. They called it easy trail, an elder statesman attacking his own party's nominee during an election year. But to Truman, it was principle. He had come from a world where politics was sweat and substance, not magazine covers and family dynasties. To him, Kennedy's charm and wealth represented everything wrong with post-war America. Style over grit, image over integrity. In private, Truman told a friend, "That boy's never had to fight for anything in his life." It wasn't jealousy. It was contempt. Truman had shoveled dirt on railroads as a teenager, fought in the trenches of World War I, and risen from obscurity to the presidency without privilege or pedigree. Kennedy, he believed, had been handed everything, including his nomination. Kennedy's response came weeks later, measured but cutting. At a press conference, he smiled for the cameras and said, "President Truman belongs to another generation. I intend to lead mine." The line was polite, but everyone understood what it meant. Truman was officially obsolete. The tension escalated when Kennedy won the presidency that November. Truman sent a short telegram of congratulations, formal, emotionless, and only 9 words long. Kennedy never replied. From that point on, their relationship was defined by silence, not the kind born of distance, but of deliberate avoidance. Every time Truman offered advice, it went unanswered. Every letter went unacknowledged. When the press asked if he planned to meet Kennedy after the election, Truman chuckled dryly. "I'll wait until he's ready for grown-up talk," he said. It was a jab that stung deeper than any insult. Kennedy told his brother Bobby, "I'll never set foot in Missouri again." That private resentment soon turned public, and the feud between two presidents, one young and golden, one old and stubborn, was about to reach the Oval Office itself. By the spring of 1961, the new Kennedy administration was in full motion, sleek, disciplined, and image-obsessed. Reporters called it Camelot. But inside the White House, one name remained forbidden: Harry Truman. It wasn't written policy, but it might as well have been. Staffers understood the rule instinctively. Truman's name did not appear in schedules, briefings, or guest lists. If an event required former presidents, they'd invite Eisenhower or Hoover, but never the man from Missouri. To Kennedy, it wasn't simply revenge, it was optics. Truman symbolized the rugged, small-town politics Kennedy had promised to move beyond, the smoke-filled room era of blunt talk and backroom deals. Kennedy's advisors feared that being photographed with Truman, the last of the New Dealers, would make their administration look old-fashioned. But there was something more personal underneath. Kennedy had grown up hearing his father, Joseph Kennedy, rail against Truman. Joe had despised Truman's recognition of Israel, his stand against Soviet aggression, and, above all, his refusal to align with wealthy power brokers like the Kennedys. In the family's private conversations, Truman wasn't a hero. He was a traitor to privilege. So, when John Kennedy took office, he inherited not only the presidency, but his father's grudges. And when Truman publicly criticized the youthful inexperience of the new president, Kennedy took it as confirmation of everything his father had warned him about. The breaking point came in March of 1961, when Truman told a Missouri crowd, "The White House isn't a place for little boys with big dreams." The quote ran in papers across the country. When Kennedy read it at breakfast, he slammed the paper down and said to his press secretary, "Then let's make sure he never sees the inside of it again." From that day forward, Truman was unofficially banned from the White House. No formal letter was sent, just a quiet directive that spread through the halls of power. No contact, no correspondence, no visits. When a young aide suggested inviting Truman to a state dinner honoring veterans, Kennedy shot it down immediately. "He's not a guest," he said flatly. "He's history." The insult wasn't lost on Truman. He'd been frozen out of the very institution he'd once saved from collapse, literally. It was Truman who'd overseen the massive post-war renovation of the White House when the building had been near structural failure. Now, he couldn't even walk through its front doors. A reporter once asked Truman if he missed the place. He replied, "Not as much as I miss respect." For the first time in American history, two presidents from the same party were waging a silent, personal war. And that unspoken feud was about to spill into the public eye. By late 1961, Washington insiders had a name for it: the Cold War inside the White House. Every journalist knew there was tension between Truman and Kennedy, but no one realized just how personal it had become. Truman broke the silence first. In December, during a press conference in Kansas City, he was asked about Kennedy's handling of the Bay of Pigs disaster. He leaned toward the microphone and said, "That young man has surrounded himself with professors who think theory wins wars. He should try listening to someone who's actually been in one." The room erupted with laughter. Headlines the next morning blared, "Truman scolds Kennedy." It was a stinging rebuke, a former president publicly mocking his successor's intelligence and competence. Kennedy was furious but refused to take the bait. He told his aides, "You don't wrestle with a man who has nothing to lose." Still, the insult cut deep. Behind closed doors, Kennedy ordered that no one in his administration was to respond or even mention Truman by name. When his press secretary was asked whether the president had read Truman's comments, Kennedy's only instruction was, "Say the White House has no comment." It became a pattern. Truman would attack, Kennedy would stay silent. And with each exchange, public curiosity grew. Newspapers began framing it like a political soap opera. The scrappy old veteran versus the glamorous young leader. Columnists called it the generational divide of the century. But what the public didn't see was how lonely both men had become, behind their respective walls of pride. Truman, who once received daily letters from world leaders, now sat in independence with a dwindling circle of visitors. He filled the silence with interviews and speeches, most of them containing subtle jabs at the Kennedy administration. When asked if he'd been in touch with the president, Truman smirked and said, "I doubt he's got my number." Meanwhile, Kennedy's inner circle tried to shield him from the noise. His brother Robert called Truman a relic of the old guard, but one advisor noted that whenever Truman's name came up, Kennedy's expression would darken. He couldn't forget the humiliation of being publicly dismissed by the man who had once represented everything he wanted to surpass. The feud reached its peak when Life magazine ran a feature titled "The President and the Man He Hates." It claimed Kennedy's White House had blacklisted Truman from all official functions. The story was accurate, and Kennedy knew it. When asked privately if he'd ever reconcile, Kennedy said, "You don't make peace with someone who tried to burn you before you took office." For both men, pride had replaced diplomacy, and what had started as politics was now personal war, waged not with armies, but with silence and sarcasm. But history has a way of forcing enemies together, and soon a single political crisis would push Kennedy and Truman face to face for the first time in years. By the spring of 1963, the feud that had once been whispered through Washington corridors had become an open secret. But the country was changing, and so was its politics. Kennedy's approval ratings were slipping, the Cold War was tightening its grip, and the Democratic Party was fracturing along generational lines. If he wanted to win re-election in 1964, Kennedy needed the old guard back on his side. That meant one thing: he needed Harry Truman. The idea came from Kennedy's advisors, not from the president himself. A reunion, they argued, would signal party unity, an olive branch to older Democrats who still worshipped Truman's plain-spoken patriotism. Kennedy hated the thought, but politics has a way of forcing humility. He agreed, reluctantly. In June of 1963, Truman received an unexpected call. A White House aide, speaking in formal tones, said the president wished to invite him to a dedication ceremony for the Truman Presidential Library in Independence, Missouri. The event would celebrate the continuity of American leadership. Truman paused, then said quietly, "Continuity, huh? Took them long enough to find my number." On the day of the event, the Missouri sun burned hot against the marble steps of the library. Crowds gathered, waving flags, waiting for the image they had been promised. Two presidents, old and new, united under one banner. When Kennedy's motorcade pulled up, the applause was thunderous. He stepped out, polished and confident, that famous smile unshaken. Truman was already waiting on the steps, his expression unreadable. For a brief moment, they shook hands, flashbulbs exploding around them, but their eyes never softened. The handshake lasted barely 3 seconds, but the photographs told a different story. The next day's newspapers called it a powerful image of reconciliation. But those who stood close enough to hear the exchange said it was anything but cordial. Kennedy muttered, "You've got quite a crowd, Mr. President." Truman replied, "Didn't need your help to get them here." The two men smiled for the cameras, but their conversation ended there. They stood side by side during the speeches, clapping at the right moments, nodding in sync, a perfect performance of political peace. But the truth was simple. There was no peace. After the ceremony, Kennedy boarded his plane without saying goodbye. As the engines roared to life, Truman watched from the tarmac, his hat in hand, his expression heavy with a mix of pride and exhaustion. He turned to a reporter beside him and said, "Nice young man. Reminds me of someone who still thinks he's running for class president." Behind the humor was a quiet sadness, the realization that history had room for only one of them at a time. For Kennedy, it was a chance to control a headline. For Truman, it was the last time he would ever see the inside of a presidential motorcade. 6 months later, the nation would mourn again, and the feud that had defined two presidencies would be cut short by tragedy. November the 22nd, 1963. The motorcade wound through the streets of Dallas, Texas. The sun was bright, the crowds cheerful, and then, in an instant, the world shifted. John F. Kennedy was gone. The news reached Independence within the hour. Harry Truman, sitting alone in his study, turned off the radio and didn't speak for several minutes. For a man who had built a life on words, that silence said everything. The two had not spoken since the library ceremony. Truman had intended to write a note, not of reconciliation, but of respect. Yet he never did. Now it was too late. Later that evening, a journalist called for comment. Truman's voice was steady but soft. He said, "He was young, full of hope, and taken too soon. The country's lost more than a president. It's lost a generation's belief in tomorrow." He hung up and walked to the window, staring into the cold Missouri night. Some said he wept. Others said he just stood there, stone still, the same way he had the day Roosevelt died. In the days that followed, Truman's tone changed. For the first time, he spoke of Kennedy not as an adversary, but as a man who had borne the same impossible weight, the burden of the presidency. He told a reporter, "It's easy to judge from the sidelines, but every man who sits in that chair finds out what the word lonely really means." Over time, the bitterness faded into memory. History softened the edges, blurring anger into irony. Two presidents who could never share a stage had become chapters in the same story. One who rebuilt a broken world, and one who tried to inspire a new one. Both were driven by pride. Both were undone by it. Today, few remember that Truman was ever banned from Kennedy's White House. But the lesson endures about power, legacy, and the quiet wars waged between generations. Every leader inherits ghosts, and every ghost leaves behind a question that power can't answer. Was it worth it? In the end, Truman's words about Roosevelt could have applied to Kennedy too. He built the road I had to finish walking. And that, perhaps, is the true story of presidents and their successors. Not rivalry, but inheritance. If this story moved you, take a moment to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Buried Battles, where the forgotten rivalries, sacrifices, and secrets of history come back to life.